Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's lecture. I'm very pleased to welcome our speaker tonight, Jeremy Lonsdale. Jeremy is a cricket historian. He has published 7 books, 5 of which are on the subject of Yorkshire cricket. And tonight's talk is on early Yorkshire cricket. So over to you, Jeremy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and hello to everybody here in this fantastic room, and to everybody online. It's really good to have the opportunity to speak in this really amazing library. Yes, today I'm going to talk on the subject of Yorkshire cricket. How did it begin? For anybody that's expecting to hear about, I don't know, Fred Truman and Jeff Boycott, I'm going to be very disappointed because I'm not going to go any further than 1846. I'm going to talk about the subject of a book that I wrote, which was published 2 years ago now, which is called The Game Emerging, Yorkshire Cricket Before the Coming of the All England 11. And I'm going to talk about how the game emerged, and I guess ultimately, what was the significance of the All England 11 when it did arrive in Sheffield and indeed in Leeds in 1846. But I really want to tell the story of Yorkshire cricket before that. I suppose I could start with what might be regarded as a bit of a strange comment, which is that cricket is quite an odd activity. And so what I've always been interested in is, how did it start? How did this odd activity start? How did it become popular? How did it become something that people paid to watch, that people practiced, that people, in some cases, made a living from? Something that was increasingly a large part of newspapers, with increasingly large columns of reports and details of clubs and matches. How was it something that ended up being taught in schools? How was it something that became the subject of great rivalries between towns and villages around Yorkshire? How was it something which increasingly became part of ordinary Yorkshire life? Yorkshire cricket has a long history and has had some great periods of success, which I think we're all familiar with: the 60s, the 30s, the 20s. Obviously, a lot less distinguished in recent years, and probably less said about the last few years, the better. And there are lots of books about Yorkshire cricket history. They tend to kind of gloss over some of the really early period, and perhaps not surprisingly, there's an awful lot from 1863 onwards, which is when the county club was established. But I've always really been interested in going back in further in time, and to try and sort of shine some light on the sort of murky early period. How did it all begin? Yeah, I mean, the traditional view of the development of cricket very much focuses on developments particularly in the 18th century in the south of England, Sussex, Kent, Surrey, London, and I guess a general impression that the game wasn't particularly developed in the north of England until well into the 19th century. The exception being around Sheffield, where the game did flourish from the 1820s onwards. And the traditional view is also really that the All England 11, which was a side that was set up in the late 1840s by William Clark, who was from Nottingham. And the traditional view is that it was really Clark's 11 arriving in parts of the north of England, Sheffield in the first case, Leeds, York, Bradford, and so on over time in the late 1840s. It was this that stimulated the interest in cricket in Yorkshire. And the traditional view, I think, really sort of emphasises the importance of cricket as it developed in the south of England for the purposes of betting, the importance of the role played by a lot of aristocrats and royal patronage, and it talks about the importance of the laws that were developed for really for the purposes of trying to ensure that with so much money at stake, there was a common understanding about how the game was organised. But I think a lot of history books really tend to ignore the north of England and could have give the impression that very little of any great significance happened until perhaps about the 1820s. My book really was, I think, it tries to tell a different story, and I think the story that I've told in the book is more that cricket in Yorkshire before the arrival of the All England 11 in 1846, playing a series of matches against local teams in Yorkshire, the game was far more developed than previously portrayed. That Sheffield, whilst it was preeminent in local cricket in Yorkshire, nevertheless the game was quite strong elsewhere, and I'll say a little bit about that. The book also really emphasises the turning point of the 1830s, and there's a whole series of developments in the 1830s, which means that the game really kicks on in Yorkshire. The book also talks a bit about the fact that ultimately the development of the game in Yorkshire was held back by a number of factors: finance, and a lack of finance being one, a lack of leadership being another, and also insufficient quality players and insufficient quality players playing together. And I talk in the book about the fact that these are constraining factors which ultimately mean that it took some time, really it's really into the second half of the 19th century that the game really flourishes in Yorkshire. And I also emphasise, I think, that the All England 11, this team of some of the best players from the south of England, that it was important in stimulating interest in cricket in Yorkshire, but that the team was really taking advantage of an existing interest. It wasn't that the All England 11 was the sort of starting point for cricket. Actually, there was already a lot of enthusiasm for the game, huge enthusiasm for the game in some parts of the county, and so the exhibition cricket that the All England 11 played was really able to tap in existing enthusiasm rather than stimulating it itself. It might just be worth just dwelling a little bit on this picture here. This is really, I think, a picture from the 1820s or 1830s, and it gives a sense of a cricket match of the time, reasonably well organised. You can see that the players are wearing whites. There is a changing tent, or two changing tents. I think there's signs that some kind of admission fee is being charged, and there's also obviously refreshments. There's a gentleman at the front there. A rather sloping field, which I think was probably fairly typical in many cases, certainly until the second half of the 19th century, wouldn't be unusual. But it's obviously a fairly traditional sort of rural scene, but it gives us a bit of sense as to how the game was seen at the time. I want to take a step back, though, really, before talking about cricket in detail, and just say a little bit about sort of changes in Yorkshire society in the sort of 18th century and the early 19th century, because I think they are important to help us understand how the game flourished. In the second half of the 18th century, a number of important economic and social developments, which I think enabled organised sports, and not just cricket, to develop. There was relative peace at home. There was the threat of the French invasion towards the end of the 18th century, which interestingly accounts for why there is cricket played on the East Coast by military teams, because there was an awful lot of soldiers there at the time. There were improvements in communications. I think there was 8 times as many coaches going between Leeds and Sheffield in 1836 as there had been in 1790. and that just made it easier for people to get around. The time of the journey from Leeds to London in 1768 was 2.5 days. It was 20 hours by 1815. So improved communications, improved roads, improvements to all kinds of aspects of communication allowed people to move around more and made the possibility of interacting, including for sport, more possible. Shift in population, the build-up of populations in towns. 2/3 of the population of Yorkshire around the end of the 18th century was in the West Riding. Sheffield, Leeds, Hull, Halifax, these were big and important towns, and start to see cricket played on quite a significant scale as a result of more and more people being brought together and being able to interact. But generally, I think it's worth saying that the north of England was, with the exception of Leeds, the exception of York, was probably less sophisticated than particularly around London, where the game had been very popular. But we do start to see improvements in towns like Ripon, Beverley, Richmond, Otley, Tadcaster, important market towns where there was quite a improvements in terms of some of the rebuilding of towns. And I think the reason I'm explaining a lot of this is because I think the game is actually associated with modernisation of English life. The increased development of newspapers, which increasingly, certainly by the beginning of the 19th century and into and certainly from the 1820s onwards, do give increasing coverage to sport. Newspapers developing in the 18th century and becoming more and more common. So I think it's important against that kind of background to sort of appreciate that there were changes within Yorkshire which created a sort of background in which it was possible for people to increasingly interact, take involvement in sport. How did the game actually start? I mean, it's impossible really when we're talking about something like cricket to know how much was played in the 18th century. I mentioned newspapers. Actually, there are very small references in the 18th century to cricket. They're very brief. Some of the first references to cricket in the Yorkshire newspapers start in the 1750s, where they tend to be reports of matches in the south of England, matches involving aristocrats, matches which are clearly for large amounts of money. So these are very unusual events, and they're certainly not. They don't go into any great detail. The first reference to a cricket club in Yorkshire is in fact in Leeds in 1760. What's interesting about that description is it's quite clear that the club must have been going for some time because there's nothing that indicates this is a brand new club. It gives the impression that pretty much anybody reading that would understand that this club has been in existence for some time, that there is a certain structure and organisation to it. I mean, the game had been popular as a folk game, I think, and there's evidence from around the country that this is the case. But clearly, it was unreported. This was just people enjoying themselves together, and it's only really, as I say, in the 1750s, particularly in Yorkshire, where we do get references to it in newspapers. There are a number of other references to cricket in Leeds in the 1760s, which suggest it was a fashionable activity amongst young men. In the 1780s, there were advertisements in Leeds newspapers for cricket prints of matches in the south of England, but nevertheless, presumably somebody who advertised it in a Leeds newspaper thought that would appeal to people in Leeds. And I think the indication by the end of the 18th century is that there was a certain amount of interest, potential interest amongst people, it was clear that this was a game that was understood and didn't need to be explained in some detail. So I think by the end of the 18th century, many people in Yorkshire would have known about the game, seen references to it in papers, which were, as I said, increasingly common, perhaps played the game, knew somebody that played the game. They probably saw that it was associated with the better off. I think, as I say, the reports tended to be matches between, for the purposes of gambling and for the purposes of money associated with the better off. But I think, nevertheless, it was possibly seen to be a fashionable activity, but one that was nevertheless, I think, spread by word of mouth. So, in my research, I go into quite a bit of detail about the early development of the game and venues, and I think what I talk about is actually that the game developed particularly in the Sheffield area. It developed particularly in Leeds, around York, and then particularly in villages and small towns in North Yorkshire. I think one of the things that's clear is, and this I think links back to the issues around communication and travel and the ease or the difficulty of getting about Yorkshire, was actually there was little or no connection initially between these sort of pockets of the game. So the people who played cricket in Leeds tended to play cricket against other people in the Leeds area. Those that played in Sheffield tended to be, initially at least, playing against others. North Yorkshire matches were between villages which are relatively close to each other. And so initially, I think what we see is a sort of different pockets of the game, which in time will kind of link up as communications improve. Matches, therefore, were usually played between people who lived a few miles apart. It used available land, common land, moorland, racecourses. These are just three images. The top one is, in fact, a game of Nur and Spell, but it's being played on a moorland, and I think that would be exactly the kind of was the sort of environment in which a lot of early cricket in the 18th century was played. The second image is, again, it's actually an archery tournament, but it's on the racecourse at York, and a lot of cricket was played in front of the grandstand in the first decades of the 19th century. It was flat. The grass was short, and it was a place that people expected to sort of be able to play sport, and where people would associate visiting to watch sport. So the racecourses also at Doncaster was another place where there was a lot of cricket, and often these venues were used not just by local cricketers, but as the game became more developed, those were seen as venues where a sort of best of three, the final of a best of three was held, a neutral venue. So having played at home and away against your rivals, you may then agree to go to York Racecourse and play the game there on a neutral venue. So those were sort of, I think, indications of the kind of venues. I mean, moorland is interesting. There was space there, and obviously the game needs space. It was a place where you could probably go and play uninterrupted, because it was away from a town or a village. So it was somewhere suitable for the game to be played. I think clearly the game, as I say, particularly in the south of England, was associated with aristocrats and the better off. I think what seems to be clear, and I think there's an awful lot of research that could be done if we could really sort of drill into the sort of names of those people that did play, is there was an awful lot of sort of independent men, self-employed men in small towns and villages who played cricket in the early years. And I think it's particularly important, I think, to sort of to appreciate that they were the kind of people that had the ability to drop their work and to play and to have discretion over their time, and perhaps they might be able to make up on their whatever work they were doing perhaps later in the week, but having played sport and having had the opportunity. So I think particularly in the first decades of the 19th century, I think we see a lot of people who still had a lot of control over their working day. I think also in the early years we see quite a lot of the evolution of the equipment. In the first slides that we saw, I think there was the sort of the hockey stick-shaped bats, and over time into the 19th century, we started to see the more standard now straighter bat, which was much easier to defend the ball, but defend against a ball which was being bowled faster, and so the equipment sort of developed over time. I think we can almost certainly say that early cricket was underreported. We know now from evidence from the 1830s, for example, from reports and obituaries of people who played, that the game had been played in the late 1790s, for example, or the early 19th century, and there's references to clubs and to matches and to people playing, which aren't actually in the newspapers of the day, the contemporary newspapers. So it seems that there were teams with reputations which went back 30 or 40 years, and we don't really know from the contemporary newspaper accounts anything about them, but we do know from later reports and obituaries that this was definitely the case. And interestingly, there were sort of reports in the 1830s, which make reference to factory teams with track records going back 30 years, but none of this was reported in the newspapers. Interesting. I think might have jumped from. No, okay, fine. Just to round off on that on this fine with this slide. I mean, I think cricket in the early 19th century. I think what we can see from the contemporary reports is it was something that was played particularly in the late summer and the autumn, and indeed often after the harvest in rural areas on into October and November and December. And I think one of the interesting things about being able to interrogate the digitized provincial newspapers is to find out how much cricket was actually played over the winter, and it's almost certainly for the purposes of betting. So there are interesting descriptions of matches taking place in the sort of 1820s in villages in North Yorkshire, where they talk about bonfires being set up and spectators standing around a bonfire, and it's obvious that this is the purpose of this game is gambling. Interestingly, the games are very popular early in the week, particularly on a Monday, sometimes on a Tuesday, and I think that again links into sort of more traditional employment arrangements, and often for people, the Saturday was a day when sort of business was brought to a conclusion, when perhaps when targets had to be met. Cricket couldn't be played on a Sunday. There was no cricket then. So Monday was probably the day when, for a lot of people, they were furthest away from having to kind of deliver on whatever it is that they promised they would do, and so felt more comfortable about spending the day in sport. And if you look at reports of cricket matches really throughout the first few decades of the 19th century, the amount of them that are played on Mondays and then Tuesdays is very significant. So really, we're talking now about a game that was, underarm bowling, low scores, very defensive games, quite long games, but with very few runs scored. Highest score in double figures would be for an individual would be a decent score. I think particularly in Yorkshire, there's no hint of the commercial side to the game that we see in London and we see in parts of the southeast. This is a game that's played very much, on a friendly basis. It's played on open ground. There are no enclosed grounds, so there's no ability to actually charge anybody to pay to watch, even if anybody would pay. And that doesn't really happen until later, and I'll say a little bit about that. And I think the game is clearly associated with betting, and there are stakes. There are stakes at stake, and money at stake, and a lot of betting on the outcome of the game. Now, I've put up these two newspaper cuttings, and I wouldn't expect you to be able to read them, but they are really interesting. Actually, two of the most interesting things I found, I think, in the course of my research. The first one comes from a Sheffield newspaper in 1838, and it's a description of a match between two teams of men over 60. And what's really interesting about it is it's a contemporary account of, from 1838, of the reporter commenting on the way in which men who were over 60 and therefore had been schooled in cricket in the sort of 1780s and 1790s and so on, how they went about playing the game. And it's quite interesting from the report. It says the game was played quite in the old style. There was slow bowling, and the blocking, snipping, on-hitting, which our fathers have seen exhibited in many a well-contested match. And it talks about the sort of different fielding positions, which appear by 1838 to have become less common. And generally, it's a sort of it's interesting that this is a contemporary account of which really sort of, I think, emphasizes that over time the game was seen to have developed and had changed over the course of 30, 40 years. And the second report, also from a Sheffield newspaper, is about it's a report of a match between Sheffield Wednesday when they played against Ripon for the first time. And I mentioned about the fact that early cricket was generally played by teams playing against the next village, or maybe a mile or two away, or certainly not much more than sort of however far you could travel on horse or in a carriage of some kind, in a few hours. This was a sort of indication that those pockets of cricket that I talked about, sort of Sheffield, North Yorkshire leagues, they were starting to connect up. And this was the first time that a Sheffield team had visited Ripon, which I think is about 70 miles away. So quite an effort went in for this. I think the Ripon club paid the expenses of the Sheffield cricketers for coming up. But what's really interesting about the report is actually how contemptuous the Sheffield reporter is of the quality of cricket that they found in Ripon. It says, in style, it proved the ugliest in England, but it was not without effect. They handled the club as Tom Warsop did when he was a little boy. So that's alluding to a name from the 18th century. And they are, in truth, the cricketers of 60 years ago. Notwithstanding, they are nothing to look at. They contrived to make some good straight hits and met a treacherous round ball as if they were not aware of the danger. The Sheffield side followed, and then it goes on. And it sort of, what's interesting there is, as well as sort of change over time, it's indicative of the fact that across Yorkshire the game had developed at a different pace, and had clearly by 1829 become a lot more sophisticated in Sheffield, certainly from the perspective of a Sheffield resident. Had become a lot more sophisticated there than it was in Ripon. Actually, Ripon was one of the best clubs in Yorkshire at the time. So it's quite interesting. It just gives it, again, another contemporary sort of sense of how the game had sort of moved at different paces around the county. That's the first reference to a cricket club, which I mentioned earlier, from 1760, and this is in Leeds. Gentlemen cricket players are desired to meet at Mr. Cowling's at Chapeltown on Monday next, the 26th, at 10 o'clock in the morning, at which place all who are willing to become subscribers are desired to attend. Dinner will be on the table at 2 as an incentive. It's the first reference to a cricket club in Yorkshire. We start to see cricket clubs, as opposed to just ad hoc matches, increasingly taking place in the late 1790s, and particularly in the early 19th century. We start to see some aristocratic support in Yorkshire. Sir William Milner, Nunn Appleton Hall, was a big supporter of the game. Sir Bellingham Graham, better known as a huntsman, was also a supporter of, an early supporter of the game. And they were backers of teams like Ripon and Wetherby. And in fact, in a number of cases, they brought up well-known professional cricketers from London to start to help improve the quality of the local sides. But we get clubs like Ripon in 1810, Hull 1813, Malton 1812, Hallam in Sheffield 1805. Often the names suggest that the members of these clubs are kind of the better off. We start to get proper cricket clothing. So the Ripon outfit was white cricket coats, calico pantaloons, woolen pumps found in Morocco. That's what they played in 1815. So there was sort of increased organisation about the game by the beginnings of the 19th century. Although at the same time, I think it's worth emphasising that the game was still, by some, seen as a nuisance. And so we still see instances of men, boys being brought in front of magistrates for playing cricket on a Sunday or for playing cricket in the roads and leaving the piles of stones that they used as wickets, leaving them there, and then inevitably with no street lights, somebody travelling in a horse and cart in the middle of the night would then crash into them. So cricket was in some people's minds associated with damage to property, unruly behaviour, and so on. And so that's a sort of the background to this development. I think the big turning point is Sheffield cricket in the 1820s, and this is an advert for a match that was played in Sheffield between the Players of Sussex, one of the more developed county teams, and the Best of All England in 1827. And this was on the new ground at Darnall, which was the second of the grounds that was built in Sheffield, and these were properly enclosed grounds. So the important thing about that is it was therefore possible to charge people to come, and therefore money was starting to be generated by the game. And that then leads on really important, because it then means that, for example, a club can then pay a professional to help coach them, so that improves the quality standards, which in turn will raise the standards of the cricket that's being offered, and therefore hopefully attract more people. And so what we see in Sheffield is a number of very kind of far-sighted, usually publicans, who set up grounds, cricket grounds, enclosed the cricket grounds, and then started to bring to Sheffield high-quality cricket. And it's, I mean, this is just one example of that. And a number of cricket professionals of the day, big cricket professionals of the day from London, were brought up. Sparks, Caldecott, Fenix, Lambert were their names in Sheffield in the 1820s. And these people came, were paid basically to coach local cricketers and to help develop the standards. Thank you. And this is a very well-known picture of cricket in Sheffield in the 1820s. I think it's 1825. I think what's important about this is that really Sheffield cricket, of all the cricket that was played in Yorkshire at the time, this is linking up Sheffield with the mainstream of English cricket. So matches are being played now at Sheffield against Nottingham, against Leicester, two of the main teams away from London. Players are coming up, teams are coming up from the south of England. So we've had the visit of Sussex, which was up there before. There was an important match in 1827 when the All England team played in Sheffield, and excellent facilities were developed. This is you can see there was a pavilion there, what we find, therefore, really by the end of the 1820s is that the standard of cricket in Sheffield and the facilities in Sheffield was way beyond what else there was in Yorkshire. So Sheffield was a sort of was a sort of the pinnacle of Yorkshire cricket at this time, and unfortunately they weren't really able to make it pay. There was a third ground built at Hyde Park in 1826, cost £4,000 in those days, which was a large amount of money. George Steer, who set up the Darnell grounds, passed on responsibility to his son-in-law, Woolhouse, who struggled and was declared bankrupt by the end of the decade. And he then became the manager at Hyde Park. So it was no guarantee, although there was increased interest. And I think in some of these cases, we're talking about 25,000 people attending a cricket match in Sheffield. Despite that, the game wasn't guaranteed to make money. Thank you. Inevitably, there will be stars in the game, and the most famous Yorkshire cricketer in those days was a guy called Thomas Marsden, who was a man from Sheffield. I think what's fantastic about Marsden is that we actually have two relics from his historic, and I mean, it is truly historic, score of 227, which he made for Sheffield and Leicester when they played against the Nottingham team in 1826. I think I mentioned that actually, double figures was a big deal in cricket at this time. It sort of improved a little bit by the late 1820s, but 227 in those days was really quite extraordinary. And we have the scorebook on the left-hand side there, and that is in fact the ball. These are both held by Weston Park Museum in Sheffield. So I think it's fantastic, 200 years old, and we have them. And in some ways, the scorebook doesn't look that different to ones that we're familiar with today. So Marsden was the big name. Sadly, he died quite young. He was the first big Yorkshire cricketer to play in the south of England, and so it's extraordinary when you actually look at newspaper reports of matches involving him, how much travelling he did in those days. He'd be playing in London, he'd be playing in Sheffield, he'd be playing in Norwich, so he really put in some miles. It wasn't a huge success in the south of England. I think quite a lot of cricket followers down there were a bit sniffy about his standing. But nevertheless, he was the kind of first big name to be playing regularly amongst cricketers in London. I think what this really emphasises is that the focus, that Sheffield was kind of looking southwards, was looking, to a higher standard of cricket than was played elsewhere, and I think it's probably worth saying that the standards of the game in other parts of Yorkshire was less was not as high. In Leeds, there was from the sort of in the 1820s, there was development of cricket. Woodhouse Moor was one of the big centres of cricket then, and again, a bit like the racecourse at York, it was one of those places where if teams had played each other home and away, Woodhouse Moor was perhaps the venue for a neutral venue for a deciding clash, and there was a lot of cricket played there, and places like Knaresborough, Ripon, Yarm, Tadcaster, Doncaster, these could all claim to be at one point or other the strongest side outside Sheffield. But I think it's fair to say that the cricket outside Sheffield was probably more parochial. Even Leeds matches in the 1820s, for example, were between local sides often on fairly unkempt fields, and was probably a bit more kind of genteel. And certainly not as commercialised as Sheffield cricket, and there were no enclosed grounds in the 1820s. But interestingly, there were some links with the south of England, even in matches with teams away from Sheffield, and disputes. You won't be surprised to know that disputes in cricket matches were fairly frequent, and remarkably, there was a sort of a system that sort of developed where a dispute might take place in a match, and the game actually might stop and actually be brought to a halt as a result of that. And the description of the issue a dispute, which probably was an umpiring decision or something about the way in which one of the teams had conducted themselves. This was written up, and then a letter was then sent to the MCC in London, or to the Bell's Life newspaper, sporting newspaper, which was published from the 1820s onwards. And they would actually ask for advice on, well, these events happened. What's the correct answer? And so a letter would be sent, and then presumably a few days later, a response would be received. And this, and the instruction would be given. Well, the umpire was right here, or the umpire was wrong here. So it's quite remarkable, really, that it would take days for a resolution of these matters. Interestingly, sometimes the teams would then simply ignore this sort of expert advice. But I just think it's very interesting that it shows how seriously the game was being taken by this time, particularly when money was at stake. But also, I think it shows that, notwithstanding that communications weren't fantastic, people still thought, we need to sort this out, and therefore we need to go to the experts, and they happen to be in London. Okay. Yeah, actually, that's the slide I thought I was going to talk about. The game elsewhere before 1829. I mean, I've said everything I was going to say. This is just the photograph's interesting. It's actually a scorebook which is in the I think it's in the library in Hull. It's a scorebook from the Beverley and East Riding Cricket Club, which from the 1820s, and it's a fantastic document. It doesn't look that different to a scorebook from today, and interestingly, it's full of little anecdotes. I can't remember them at the moment, but there are little annotations from whoever was scoring, which suggests he had a fairly dim view of the behaviour of some of his colleagues in the course of the match. But this was, I think, a score of a match between Beverley and Doncaster or something like that. So again, it just sort of emphasises that the game was starting to get very organised, and people took it seriously, and a lot of the sort of basic planks of the modern game are clearly in place. I said earlier, I think the 1830s is the decisive decade, and the reason I say that is I think by the 1830s travel was clearly easier, and therefore we started to see the connections between these different pockets of cricket. Sheffield, I mentioned Sheffield and Ripon. Teams started to play longer distances. Teams from Leeds might go to play in different parts of North Yorkshire, and so we start to see linking up between different groups of cricketers, and start to see references in newspaper reports of matches in Sheffield, which make it quite clear that amongst the crowd are people who have travelled from different parts of Yorkshire to watch this big match. And so we do start to see interaction between cricketers, and I think that's really important. It was clearly easy for people to move around. So, for example, in 1828, the owner of the ground in Leicester, when they played against Sheffield, he decided he needed a particular professional from London to come and coach his side in advance of this match against the great Sheffield side. So he went all the way down to London to try and engage a professional to come and coach the Leicester team. He got there and discovered that, in fact, this man wasn't available. So he travelled on even further down to Brighton, and he brought back a professional from Brighton to coach his Leicester side to take on Sheffield. So people were clearly taking the games very seriously by this time. So communication is one thing in the 1830s. I think the introduction of round arm bowling as opposed to underarm bowling is something which started to spread slowly in the course of the 1830s. And it's quite clear by reports in the mid-1830s that some teams were clearly using what was regarded as a modern approach. Some thought it was very inappropriate, but we start to see matches where teams are bowling in different ways, and teams are starting to come up against teams who play differently and are having to adapt quite quickly. And there's one or two games where it's quite clear that there are a number of bowlers bowling in quite different ways. And so I think the 1830s is really interesting for that kind of transition. We start to see field placing much more sophisticated, wicket keeping becomes more of a specialism. And then really importantly, we start to see, not just in Sheffield, but outside Sheffield, that we see grounds that are enclosed. 1834, the York Club moves from the racecourse closer to the river, and there is a ground there, and it is then possible for on this ground to charge. Leeds in 1838, the Victoria Ground on Woodhouse Moor is established. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a minute. That is the first that is the first enclosed ground in Leeds, and in Bradford 1839. So in all these places, the game is now starting to be. It's possible to generate more money, and that's starting to lead to a ratcheting up of quality. Thanks. What was the appeal? I think for some people, cricket was seen as a sort of return to traditional English values at a time of change, huge amounts of upheaval, particularly in Yorkshire in the course of the 1820s and 1830s, with huge increase in the population in the towns and cities. And so, some people see cricket as a bit of a tradition, a return to tradition. Interestingly, for others, actually, the game's seen as a really modern activity, and it's something which is sort of not associated with the sort of barbarism and violence of a lot of traditional sports. So there are two kind of competing views about the same thing. I think there are a number of justifications for this. I think at the time, the game was seen as, well, there's not really much physical contact involved, and therefore, this enables people of all kinds of strength and so on to play against each other. A 2 innings match, that's quite a nice idea. If you don't succeed in the first innings, well, there's always the second chance, which is good if you've travelled quite a long way to play your local rivals. The game was seen as having clear rules, and as I say, there are clearly arbiters of the rules who could be called on if necessary. Meals are taken in the course of the game, which makes it very much a sort of social activity, inevitably probably ending up in the local pub. So the game was seen both as a sort of traditional activity, but also a modern and a social one, and one which I think increasingly in the course of the Victorian period was seen as a game which people felt they wanted to be involved with. So what we also see in the 1830s onwards is the sort of slow emergence of county cricket, which is really all about the sort of, as I say, these different pockets of cricketers in different parts of the county increasingly interacting. And so from the 1830s onwards, we start to see matches played by teams with a label of Yorkshire. I mean, they're clearly not representative sides. They're often heavily biased to Sheffield cricketers, but they do give a sense in which local cricketers were starting to look beyond their own immediate environment. Teams were starting to look at each other and sort of judge themselves against each other. Teams started to get a reputation as the best in Yorkshire. And we also see, for the first time, 1833, Yorkshire played against a Norfolk team. And there are a number of attempts to have Yorkshire matches in the course of the 1830s, although they stop after, I think, 1836, because the match in Sheffield against Norfolk was a financial disaster. And it was just very expensive to bring players together. It was quite clear that in order to play another county, you actually needed to practice, and therefore people needed to be brought together even earlier. So there was a lot of expense around county cricket, which meant that it took a long time, and it's not really surprising that it wasn't until the 1860s that Yorkshire County Cricket Club was established. But what you do get, and this is again a really interesting article from 1828, where this writer is talking about the idea of a county club, and this is 35 years before Yorkshire County Cricket Club was established. And what it says is, we put the proposition to the patrons of the game throughout the riding that if desirous Yorkshire should retain its reputation for practicing in perfection the most elegant athletic amusement in Europe, they should form a common club for the county. It says this measure would bring the best players known to each other It would enable them to concentrate their strength and by the collection of a small contribution, produce an adequate fund to pay certain players for practicing, make up stake money, travelling expenses, etc. And then it says, at present, we merely hint at the expediency of forming a county club. But if those noblemen and gentlemen of fortune who patronise the game should think favourably of the proposition, we will at another opportunity enter into further detail. So basically, the sorts of justifications for having a county club there are really very much the ones that continued, and were argued about in the 1860s. And yet, and this suggestion from somebody far-sighted in writing in the Sheffield Independent, is if only some people with some money could dip in their pockets, we might be able to get this off the ground. Clearly, it didn't. Not for another 35 years, anyway. Yeah, very, very briefly, a couple of other local celebrities. And I think what I find really interesting about Yorkshire cricket at this time is it's quite clear that there are a number of people. I mentioned Thomas Marsden, but there are a number of cricketers and sort of cricket administrators who really push the game in the 1830s, 1840s, and so on. And this is a gentleman called Richard Letby, who I've described as the father of York cricket. And the great thing about Letby is we actually got a picture of him. Because in 1850, after being a cricketer in York and the secretary for most of that time, the club, which had by that time some quite wealthy supporters, decided that they would commission a portrait of him by a Victorian artist called William Grimshaw, who just happened temporarily to be living in York and a member of the York Cricket Club. And so he painted a portrait which was finished in 1850, and there was it was very popular and lots of prints were made of it. And so we do have this image of Richard Letby, and he's obviously wearing a very nice, smart cricket outfit in front of York Minster there. But it's a lovely image. He was a publican and a very long-standing supporter of the game in York, and there's all sorts of interesting things which I can't talk about at the moment about Letby, which kind of emphasise that he really galvanised the game in the area. And the second one, which is closer to home, is Robert Cadman, who was the founder of the Victoria Ground in Leeds. And this is a map that shows Woodhouse Moor, but with the Victoria Ground, which was enclosed, and he opened that in 1838, and that was where the big cricket matches in Leeds in the 1840s and 1850s were played. Cadman was a land proprietor, and he bought a lot of land. He bought the land adjoining Woodhouse Moor, and he opened Victoria Ground. He sold it in 1858 to Thomas Clapham, the entrepreneur who opened the Leeds Royal Park. Cadman's a really interesting character, and the snuff box, or the box there, the silver box, was presented to him by the Leeds Cricket Club for all his efforts as secretary sometime in the 1830s. He's got an interesting history, appears to have an interesting hidden history, but which I can talk about later if we've got time. So people like Cadman, Letby, I think are kind of really important in driving the game forward in their particular area. The Victoria Ground became the place where lots of quite high-profile competitive cricket was played. It was enclosed. There was a lot of money generated, and it helped to really drive up standards. Thanks. So by the 1840s, I think what we've got in Yorkshire, which I think has been overlooked really in the past, is we've got some really quite competitive cricket between towns: Sheffield, Bradford, Leeds, Knaresborough, Yarm, perhaps Rochdale over in Lancashire. There are regular matches now being played each year in the 1840s between these teams. So these are quite substantial cricket clubs playing each other and playing quite high standard cricket. And they're attracting quite a few thousand people to these matches, and they're generally being played in enclosed grounds. Because money is being generated, these clubs are able to bring in professionals, pay professionals. And so not only would the professionals be raising the standards of local players, but they'd be performing for the club in their matches, and often being the sort of the stars of the sides. We start to see a lot of ground improvements, a lot of money starting to be invested in the 1840s in railing off cricket grounds or putting up sheds where equipment can be kept. We're seeing membership of clubs increasing. And so I think by the 1840s and by the sort of middle of the 1840s, there is a competitive sense in Yorkshire cricket. And standards are rising. Signs of better organisation and competitiveness. This is a letter on Hull Cricket Club headed notepaper, inviting or requesting, in fact, a member to attend every afternoon for practice at 3:30 precisely. So, I mean, again, lots of clubs had rules. If you broke the rules, you get fined. Quite detailed and considerable expectation that this member would turn up at 3:30 every afternoon of the week. And big matches, a lot of money at stake. Sheffield and Leicester there for £100 in 1839. Increasingly, clubs were formalised. They've got rules, they've got scorebooks, they've got accounts which are audited, prescriptive rules. The bigger ones are starting to attract quite wealthy patrons, and they start to have a well-established social side. I think one of the themes of cricket in Leeds was the cricket club often had a link with the theatre, and so would often sort of sponsor a play. Quite a lot of aristocratic supporters in different parts of the county. So they become increasingly well organised. The downside to all this, the downside to having lots of people in the cricket ground, lots of money at stake, lots of betting, lots of local rivalries, of course, we end up with disputes and violence. And I think what's really interesting, particularly in the 1840s and so on, is the amount of matches which have ended in disputes, and they kind of just abandoned it because they couldn't come to an agreement. And this is from the Leeds Times, July 1842, a match between Otley and Woodhouse. The attendance of spectators on this occasion was very numerous, including a large proportion of the fair sex. It is much to be regretted that the Leeds men were frequently insulted, and on their leaving the town were actually pelted with stones, without the Otley men intervening, which is certainly nothing to their credit, considering the Leeds men behaved like gentlemen. I mean, that's I wouldn't say it's typical, but these are not infrequent. We get these reports of matches where either spectators ran on the field because they were unhappy about an umpire dispute, or teams simply wouldn't carry on because they were very unhappy with something that had happened in the game. And so, there is a bit of a sort of, at times, a bit of a theme, an undercurrent of trouble. There were one or two clubs that get reputation for being kind of troublemakers. But given there's quite a lot of money at stake, and given there's quite a lot of local rivalry at stake, I guess this is inevitable. So the state of the game by the mid 1840s then was, I think it was played. It was played really all over Yorkshire. It was played in rural areas. It was played in urban areas. Thousands were involved on a pretty regular basis. I mean, it's impossible to put a number on it, but there were a lot of matches, and you start to see in the Leeds Times, for example, long lists of scores of matches. Many places had more than one club. Many clubs had more than one side. Started to have junior teams and so on. All kinds of bodies had clubs, so literary institutes. Obviously public houses, but workplaces, schools. It just, the game was really spreading, and it was, I think, particularly in the 1840s, we really start to sort of see it embedding itself into Yorkshire life. It was a feature of day trips. It was, a game that was In some cases, it started and then it sort of died out a little bit. Then it got revived. You see clubs sort of falling apart, perhaps when some of the key players stopped playing or got too old to play or moved away, and then you see the clubs being revived and then put on a much firmer footing, as I say, with proper rules and proper committees and all the sort of structures that you need to keep an organisation going when one or two people drop out. So really, the thrust of my book, and I'm kind of come to conclusion now, is that by the time that this famous All England 11 arrived in Yorkshire in 1846 to play the first games against local teams, Yorkshire cricket was a pretty vibrant and widespread sport. It was well organised. It was played by a lot of people. There was a huge amount of enthusiasm. There was at that sort of highest level some pretty high standard cricket being played between some of the bigger, most populated parts of the county. And therefore, when these famous players from the south of England arrived, they really were able to tap into something which was, there was an enthusiasm that they could tap into. They helped to stimulate it even more. But I think what I've set out in my book in some detail, is that the game was in a pretty strong position. I think, though, in saying that, the game in Yorkshire did need the sort of stimulus of this sort of commercialised cricket that the All England 11 brought. It did need it to sort of take to a next level, and because the reason for that, I think, is that there's evidence. Really, there was a number of significant obstacles to the game taking off even further without external stimulus, and there are three reasons. I think one is a lack of money. There are very few enclosed grounds. Most cricket is just played on open land, very small scale, and there really isn't a huge amount of money in the game, and therefore, it really does need an injection of new resources. There's a lack of leadership as well. Sheffield was the centre of Yorkshire cricket, but actually in the 1840s, it's a bit of a low ebb. Wasn't really well placed to provide that kind of leadership, and I think also some of the sort of aristocrats that were interested in cricket, and there were only, I would say, only a small number. I don't think they were either willing or really in a position to take the lead. And I think in those days that would have been regarded as necessary. And certainly in the south of England, you see, county clubs, and you look at the patrons, they're all titled people. So I think there's a bit of a sort of vacuum of leadership in Yorkshire at the time. And I think there's a limited number of really high quality players, and I think they're spread really thinly. And so some of the teams, they've got one or two stars, but they're not really very strong. So I don't think the momentum in the 1840s could just come from within in Yorkshire, and it needed something else, and it needed the sort of spark that the All England 11 provided. And what we see is them exploiting the existing enthusiasm. It met a growing appetite for the game in Yorkshire, and it provided a sort of different model, really. The whole team was well known, and they played against a local team, and often local cricket, the local district team had to be 22 players, because obviously if you've got the top stars of the day coming from the south of England to play against much more modest cricketers, you're going to have a lot more of them. It was played initially in some of the major cricket sort of loving centres like Leeds and Bradford and Sheffield and so on, but actually increasingly the All England 11 and some of the other touring 11s which copied the All England 11 model, they started to play in smaller towns around Yorkshire, and it really sort of, you look at the reports and you can see that it was a massively exciting event for some quite small towns in different parts of Yorkshire when these top players turned up to play against their local players. And of course, local players tended not to be good enough, even if you had 22 of them. So those teams used to bring in professionals to sort of bolster the quality on their side. So what we see then in the 1840s and 1850s is sort of this model of sort of exhibition cricket as it really probably was, but it helped to stimulate cricket around the county and indeed around the country. So it is really important, and I'm not sort of diminishing the importance at all. But I think what I've tried to explain in some detail is that actually the game was quite developed in Yorkshire already, and this was a sort of this kind of cricket from 1846 onwards sort of took advantage of what was there already. And I think I'm going to leave it there and just sort of wrap it up and take any questions.
Thank you, Jeremy, for that very interesting talk. Do we have any questions in the room? Yes.
Are there any mentions of sort of precursor games that are similar to cricket, but not sort of identical, such as grounders in Yorkshire, just before we start hearing about cricket?
I don't know. I'm sure there were. And there is quite a sort of, I mean, it seems inevitable that there would be lots of games involving sticks and balls and bats and people measuring how many times somebody ran round somewhere. I think it's a really interesting question. It's probably unknowable, isn't it? Now, why did we end up with this sort of particular model? Why did we end up with 2 and then eventually 3 stumps? Why did we end up with something that was 22 yards? Sadly, it's probably lost even further back in history than I've been talking about. But I think the answer to your question has to be yes, there were. Whether they were reported, probably not. These are just kind of folk games. These are sort of people having fun. So it wouldn't really be any sort of evidence that they took place, sadly, unless somebody wrote about them, perhaps in a diary, which we have. But I mean, it is a really interesting subject, and not something I looked at for this. But there is a kind of that whole sort of prehistory of ball games and bat games, which and I think not just in this country, but in other countries, there are descriptions of games which clearly sound a little bit like cricket. So yeah, it's unfortunate that I don't really think we've got any great sort of records of this, but yeah, I think the answer has to be yes, there must have been.
Why was Sheffield preeminent?
That's a good question. I think there are sort of a number of factors. I mean, it's the most southerly part of Yorkshire, and therefore closest to the sort of where the game appears to have started and spread northwards. It's probably a place with good communications with places that were, as I say, very quickly they started to play against Nottingham, for example, or against Leicester. I think there's probably something about the environment, and I'm sure I've seen, and the sort of the landscape. I'm sure I've seen discussion about whether or not the sort of the type of environment was quite similar to environments where the game was sort of had developed in the south of England. I think, I mean, in terms of the specifics of how did the game develop in the 1820s, I mean, there are just one or two kind of entrepreneurial publicans who saw the opportunities. I think there was, I've seen reference to the fact that there were complaints in the early 1820s. There weren't any cricket grounds to play on, and there were people who clearly wanted to. And I think one or two publicans sort of thought, actually, there's a bit of opportunity here. So 1822 is the first ground, is the first Darnall ground, and they become places where people could go and play cricket. They could buy drinks, and they could spend time with friends, and so and cricket grew up around there. They were available to hire, and so I think those individuals must have stimulated the game in Sheffield in particular. But there's probably the sort of the big issues of geography and the sort of environment as well. I'd probably, I think a lot of activity in Sheffield, improvement in Sheffield, is possibly also associated with sort of modernisation and so on.
Thank you.
Talking about Darnall itself, of course, one of the problems was that there was people got injured, didn't there? There was the actual stand collapsed, which didn't help the situation. And also the feeling was that Darnall was too far away from the centre of Sheffield, even in those days.
Yeah. And
that's why they went to Hyde Park, which was nearer to Sheffield itself. Then Hyde Park finished and went on to Bramall Lane.
Yeah.
Because the Bramall Lane was actually in the centre itself.
I think it's interesting how quite a few of the big grounds, cricket grounds in some of the big urban areas started on the outskirts, possibly because the game was still associated in many people's minds with sort of people wasting their time or with trouble causes or whatever. You actually start to see as the game becomes more organised. You start to see the grounds moving closer into the sort of areas of population, which presumably is an indication that actually people were more comfortable with the idea that these sporting venues were in town. You see that in one or two places where, and I think it is indicative of the game becoming sort of accepted.
When the All England players came and took on the Yorkshire teams, how long did it take the Yorkshire teams to become competitive? Is there sort of a landmark victory for the Yorkshire teams?
Well, I think what's interesting was, it varies a huge amount. It very much depends on it depended on the ability of a sort of the locally organised team to, if they had a number of really high quality players of their own, that helped. But as I say, the general view was that we need some help, and therefore they would pay for professionals to come. And there were a number of players. There was Ike Hodgson from Bradford and William Slynn from Sheffield, who in particular were players who would be drawn in and paid to beef up the local side, and they played in the 1850s and 1860s as what were called given men. And so there was I think there was probably a bit of negotiation between William Clark and the local team to make sure that actually the local team didn't become too strong, because they didn't want to be humiliated. But you only have to look at the scores, and you see that the local team, 22 of them, well, lots of them were just getting single figures, and lots of them were just reasonably good local players. Clark's team were beaten on occasions, and on occasions I think he did moan about the fact that whichever district he was playing against, actually they'd rather overdone it. So I'm not sure. And I think what's interesting about these, they continue. This was very popular in the 1850s. This kind of cricket, 11 well-known players against 22 or 18 local players. It was popular to start with, but I think increasingly in the 1860s, actually a lot of people have got a bit bored with it, because it wasn't really very competitive. First of all, the 11. Even if they were really top players, they actually struggle to score when there's 22 fielders. So that's quite. There's a lot of people. There's a lot of people you've got to try and get it past. So that was a bit of a problem. And then the touring teams. There was a number of touring teams copied this model, and actually the quality of some of them wasn't that good. So the standard of the cricket wasn't that great. And I think there's evidence that people got bored in the 1860s by it, and they weren't as popular. Not as many people turned up, and therefore they just became less financially viable. So it sort of dies off in the 1870s and sort of trickles on, I think, into the 1880s. But by that time, of course, you've got county cricket up and running, certainly by the 1870s, on a much bigger scale. And so I'm not sure there's not any kind of great event. It's more a kind of, there was a kind of a model of cricket which sort of had its time, and it certainly stimulated huge enthusiasm in as I say, in lots of parts of Yorkshire. But it was kind of its time, and well, I'm not sure we've seen it replicated in the last 150 years. But the sort of excitement that was generated perhaps is being generated by things like the 100 and so on, that kind of atmosphere. If you can imagine the 100 in Victorian England.
Yeah. Okay, the back.
Well, I like class distinction sort of thing. Would you never be able to play alongside your doctor, or will it, and if it were like that in Yorkshire, was it like that throughout the country as well, or what are the differences?
I mean, the answer has to be yes, absolutely. There's absolutely no question about that. I mean, there's a whole kind of sort of mythology, isn't there, about the idea that cricket was the great leveller, and the Lord could open the batting with his butler or something. I mean, there's an element of that, and it is quite. I mean, it's. I did try and do a little bit of research, because there are scorecards in some newspapers, say in the 1830s, which don't just give the surname, but they actually give the whole name of somebody who played in a village team. And actually, if you can then look them up you can kind of look at, certainly after 1841 with the census, you can actually try and spot these people, particularly if they've got slightly unusual names. So I did get a little bit of a sense of the kind of people who were playing. But I mean, if anybody wanted to kind of, there's a whole amount of research there in itself. So I think there was a mix. I did talk right at the beginning about the fact that I think an awful lot of people who could afford the time, there tended to be people that perhaps they were sort of small business people in towns who they could close their shop and go and play. There were in parts of Yorkshire there was aristocratic involvement and there were supporters of the game, and the young sons would be playing in the local team, Hovingen and places like that, Harewood. But I don't know. I mean, the answer has to be that the game was in Victorian England was hugely class conscious, and probably became more so. I mean, I'm interested in the developments at York, and in the late 1840s, the York Club clearly went out of its way to try and attract the better off. I think partly because they needed money. They needed money for all the developments. They wanted to level their field. They wanted to enclose the ground. They wanted to bring professionals in. That all cost money, and relatively, the less well off, they could maybe pay their own subscription, but they couldn't start to put anything else towards the sort of sums of money that were needed for this kind of infrastructure development. And so I think what you see in places like York is they're having to attract more and more better off people who may not necessarily play, but they would kind of be patrons of the club, and that helped to pay for a lot of this improvements in grounds and clubs and so on. But I think it did then mean that you had you then find York. I think you start to see sort of amateur. You start to see the better off playing, setting up their own sort of 11, and not necessarily alongside other people who were less well off. We start to see a sort of class distinctions. I mean, I haven't gone into this in any great detail, but I think the answer to your question has to be, it's Victorian England, and therefore I think the sort of social distinctions are fairly clear.
Yeah.
Christian, fascinating talk. Do we know anything about the spectatorship? Who is actually going to watch these games as well as who's going to play them?
I mean, I'm very interested in that subject, so I've tried to put as much as possible in the book about it. There are sort of small references. For example, we know that certainly by the 1830s, and particularly once the railway network is much developed in Yorkshire, that you do get people travelling quite long distances. I think there's a reference to a match in the 1820s where there was a newspaper report made reference to the fact that people couldn't get a coach from London up to the match at Sheffield because it was packed and there were so many people going to the cricket. So those were clearly better off people. I don't think there's at this particular point in time. There's not a huge amount of detail about it. I mean, Brian mentioned the match at Sheffield where there was a crowd of nearly 20,000, 25,000. And one of the stands collapsed. That's often as much as you get. In the second half of the 19th century, the newspapers go into a lot more detail about crowds, and certainly by the sort of 1870s, 1880s, you actually do get descriptions from within the crowds, which are really interesting. And actually, in the book the other book that I wrote about this, which is really looking at the whole the later Victorian period. There's a whole chapter in there on cricket crowds, but that's particularly 1880s and so on, where I think newspapers, they just gave much more coverage to cricket, and sometimes they would send a reporter into the crowd at Bramall Lane, and they would be quite interesting, amusing descriptions of the kind of people that were watching. But in the period I've talked about, and really not much information. I mean, you needed to be able to afford to pay whatever it was, sixpence to get in. I think there are references to the fact that they cut the price, for the second day or for the last 2 hours, and a huge number of extra people came in, which suggests that it was kind of that was sort of at the margins of what people thought they could afford, or
Can I just come in back to this? I've been doing research about Dewsbury, games at Dewsbury in 1882, and there was the actual admittance cost was 1 and 6, which they thought it was too expensive, and that's one of the reasons why people didn't turn up and watch the game.
Yeah.
So I don't know what the actual weekly wage would be, but I would have thought it was similar type of thing. So it was expensive to watch the game.
Yeah, and I think when the Australians, when towards the end of the 19th century, when the Australians toured quite regularly in the 1880s and so on, I think there was a big row. I think 1 year, because I think at Bramall Lane they put it up to 2 shillings, and that was just regarded as ridiculous, and the crowd was affected by that. So it was clearly price sensitive.
I was very interested. One of your early slides talked about players of over 60 playing. I would have thought in terms of life expectancy at that time, that would have been very close to the end of their days. Now, of course, we don't know how energetically they play. But what was it? Something for older people?
No, I think this was. I mean, this is. I think the fact that it was reported, is an indication. This was a kind of a novelty, and it was. I mean, it was not totally unknown, and there were, but sort of novelty in Victorian England was. You often see all sorts of strange things. I mean, that guy Richard Letby I mentioned, he in the 1840s he was involved in a running race against a horse. Those sorts of things were not unusual. So an over 60s cricket match was almost certainly just a novelty. But what's really, as I say, what was really interesting about the report was it gave a view from somebody in the late 1830s on gosh, look how much the game has changed over the last kind of 40 years. These guys are playing. They were trained in the 1770s and 1780s, and how old-fashioned and quaint it looks. So no, I mean, I think it's I've never seen another reference to such a game.
Just mention one other thing. There's an auction coming up, a night's auction coming up on Friday for 3 days, which includes a scorecard from the Victoria ground, which I gave to Jeremy, and I think that explains some of the scores that were actually made at that particular time. I would think I've never seen a scorecard of a match in Victoria ground at all, and I've been collecting, if you remember, for 30 odd years. I hope, although it won't survive that, which will be coming up on Sunday. So that's just an interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's this one, isn't it, Brian?
That's the one. I think,
yeah, I mean, interestingly, by this time it's called the Leeds Royal Park.
Yeah.
This is 1863, so kind of things have moved on a little bit from Mr. Cadman's day, but you know, it was an important venue in Yorkshire. I mean, the other interesting thing, sorry, just relating to Leeds cricket, and I've only, this isn't in the book because I've only actually just been sent this reasonably recently, but somebody sent me some links to a newspaper, Leeds newspaper from 1924, when the minute books and scoring books from the Leeds Cricket Club from the 1820s had been discovered, and they were, and so there was 3 articles in the Leeds Times, I think it was, which sort of long articles where the sort of, you know, the interesting things from these minute books from the 1820s were sort of set out, and it goes into huge detail about the sort of the rules of the club, the kind of clothes that they wear, all the fines that were imposed for unpunctuality, and all the rest of it. And it was just really interesting. I mean, it sort of reinforces, I think, the points that I talk about in the book about, you know, how fragile cricket was in those days. You know, club was, you know, they lost a load of members, and so suddenly they don't play for a couple of years, and then they revive, and so on. But you know, really interesting, and I don't know, and I'm going to try and follow up to discover whether or not these minute books and score books, which suddenly re-emerged in 1924, whether they actually you know, who's got them, because you know, they'd be fascinating documents.
Is that the Leeds Clarigan? Is it Leeds Clarigan club rather than the Leeds? Because the Leeds didn't come into effect until Headingley arrived in 1890. Right?
Yeah, well, it does describe them as Leeds Cricket Club, established by resolution on June the 26th, 1820. So, but I mean, the names were changing all the time. But they you know, they played on Woodhouse Moor, and but anyway. Right. So.
Okay, all done.
Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you again, Jeremy. That was a great talk.